saying grace before carving a turkey at Thanksgiving. Pennsylvania, U.S., 1942. That was the caption underneath this photo that I received in an email from the Christian Coalition of America in 2012, just a few days before Thanksgiving and just 2 weeks before the re-election of President Barack Obama. Now, I found this a little bit curious at the top of the email, but I didn't think a lot about it until I read down the page and found this kicker at the end of the email, and it said this: "We are about to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the first Thanksgiving, and God has still not withheld his blessing from this nation, although we now so richly deserve such condemnation. We have a lot to give thanks for, but we should pray to our Heavenly Father and ask him to protect us from those enemies outside and within who would like to see America destroyed." End of the email. Now, I immediately saved this email because it was quite remarkable. And this was long before I was working on the book, but I thought, what is going on, right? And this kind of apocalyptic language after the re-election, of a president in the country. And as I began to unpack it, what I realized was going on is that this was actually quite important to pay attention to. And that for many conservative Christians in the country, the demographic changes in our country, and very much symbolized by our first African-American president, who was now going to be a two-term president, signaled the end of something I began calling white Christian America. This idyllic and mythical memory of white Christian and essentially white Protestant dominance in the U.S. So I think it's that event, and I began looking at the numbers in my day job at PRRI. I look at religion and politics numbers all the time. And as I began to look at the demographic changes in the country, I realized that we had crossed some very significant thresholds in just the last few decades. And that this kind of apocalyptic language wasn't just invented out of thin air, but it was actually responding to very significant changes in the country. And that if we really get our heads around these changes, we'll see, I think, some clues about why our current politics have become so visceral, and in this apocalyptic key, almost any issue that we're talking about. So what I want to do in just a few minutes before we sit down and have a little bit of a conversation and take some questions is just run through a few of the changes that give you a flavor of just how dramatically some things have changed and just how much they are really taking us to a point where we as a nation are, in fact, experiencing a kind of identity crisis as a once strong demographic majority is actually fading from the scene. So let me just kind of walk you through it a bit. First of all, so that I'm not misunderstood, I should be very clear about what I mean by this term white Christian America. I certainly don't mean the end of all white Christian churches in the country. You wouldn't have to walk very far in any city to see, just a few blocks to see. That's certainly not true. I certainly don't mean the end of all white Christians. I could probably take any row in this venue and kind of falsify that claim. But what I do mean is the end of a cultural era. This era of waspy, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant dominance in the country, where white Christians in particular did have their hands on the levers of power and very much controlled the culture and set the tone for the country. One of the historians I was using for research in the book put it this way, and I've always thought this is a nice pithy way of putting it. He said, look, if you were in charge of something big and important in the middle of the 20th century, chances are you were white, you were male, you were Protestant, and you were straight. Right? That's really who was controlling the country in the middle of the 20th century. So let me just show you a few slides here. Again, I'll try to move through these, and what you're really looking for is the patterns of change over time, not so much the individual numbers. But I got to think of these as vital signs for this cultural world of white Christian America that has been really on the decline in the last few years. So first of all, if I only had one chart to put up, I would probably use this one. For those of you who are stats people and love numbers and charts, you'll be happy to know I have more than one chart. For the rest of you, just hang on. I'll take it slow. And again, it's the patterns that you want to look for. But this is really not that far back, right? 2004 to the present. And I'm going to plot up here just two lines. One is the percent of the country who identifies as white, non-Hispanic, and Christian overall. And this is any type of Christian, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, non-denominational, you name it. If they identify as Christian, this is the percentage of Americans over time. So here's that slide. Here's that trend line. And you can see it's a fairly precipitous drop, in particular over the last decade. So if we just rewind ourselves to 2 election cycles ago, back to 2008, when Barack Obama was first running for president, 54% of the country identified as white and Christian. That number today is 43%. So in our last election cycle, it's dropped to 43%. That's 11 percentage points in just about a decade, a little more than a percentage point a year. That's a pretty fast drop. The other issue that I think is important for taking the kind of pulse of the culture is support for same-sex marriage. There's another issue where attitudes have changed very, very quickly. We tend to not see in public opinion surveys issues that take off like this, but you'll take a look at these numbers. So this is the percentage of Americans who support same-sex marriage. Again, if we just go back to Barack Obama's first election bid, only 4 in 10 Americans supported same-sex marriage. Barack Obama himself did not support same-sex marriage in 2008. By the time we get to 2016, that number has essentially been flipped on its head, from only 4 in 10 favoring same-sex marriage to only 4 in 10 opposing same-sex marriage in this fairly short amount of time. We have numbers from some recent polling in 27 that shows that number, in fact, has now crossed the 60% mark and is somewhere around 65%. So just between last year and this year, we've seen another jump in these attitudes. The main reason I want to put this up here, just have you pause for a second, is to kind of take in that if you are a conservative white Christian, right, this is a head-spinning amount of change, right? Where you have been a part of a political movement that has been all in opposing same-sex marriage, you've been accustomed to being the demographic majority in the country, and all of this happens coincidentally while we have our first African-American president in the country. I put that up to say, like, some of the upheaval that we're experiencing, I think, is in response to these very big cultural and demographic shifts in the country. And it's maybe not that surprising that we're wrestling with some of these big changes. So let me back up and just tell you some of the big numbers in the country. So 43%, there's that number, the big wedge there. This is the basic lay of the land in terms of religious affiliation and religion and race in the country. About 43% white Christians in the country, about a quarter non-white Christian. If you take all non-Christian religiously affiliated people, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, etc., it makes 7% of the country, and then about a quarter of the country now claims no religious affiliation whatsoever. And the thing to know about these slices here is that the white Christian wedge is actually shrinking. The non-white Christian edge is actually growing. The non-Christian religious group is also growing, but at a very slow pace. And this quarter of Americans who claim no religious affiliation is basically exploding. All right, so that's the kind of trends that we're looking at in the country. You can see this pretty clearly if you look at generational divisions in the country. And you can think about this chart as a kind of archaeological dig down through generational strata, right? We've got the young people on top, we've got seniors down here at the bottom. And I'm going to put up, first of all, the percent of each generational strata that identifies as white and Christian. And so, you know, the best thing we have as social scientists for a kind of future crystal ball is looking at generational shifts as a kind of way of thinking about what the future portends. But check this out. This is the percentage of each generation that identifies as white and Christian. So if you look at seniors here, about nearly 2/3 of seniors identify as white and Christian. But by the time you get down to Americans under the age of 30, which is a very large generation, this millennial generation of Americans, it's only about a quarter of the country who identify as white and Christian. So you can see that just over the generations that are alive today, the market share of each generation that's white and Christian has diminished by a factor of about 2.5, just over the generations that are here existing today. Here's the rest of those categories, and you can see the other big difference here is this big orange bar, right, the religiously unaffiliated group. That's the biggest change. Among youngest Americans, nearly 4 in 10 claim no religious affiliation whatsoever, right, compared to only about 1 in 10 seniors. That's the other big piece of this sea change. One other way of thinking about this is to kind of look and ask, well, is this all due to just one segment of the white Christian population? And it turns out it's actually not. So typically we divide up white Christians into evangelical Protestants, the more conservative end of white Protestantism, into mainline Protestants, that's like Episcopalians, and other more liberal Protestants, and then Catholics as well. And if I put up the numbers here, you can see that basically every group, every subgroup is experiencing some decline. Again, I'm only going back 10 years now, so this is not very far. But here are the other two groups. But it's basically the same story, right? White evangelicals, white mainline Protestants, white Catholics. It's essentially all branches of the white Christian demographic that are sharing in this decline over time. What does all this mean? We're going to talk about a little bit of this in a minute, but I want to just at least dip my toe in the water of what this means in terms of our, I think, cultural struggles, our political struggles, by just giving you two numbers from this last election cycle that I think give some insight into what's happening. In particular, I think with the more conservative end of the white Christian world, white evangelical Protestants, who I think have been some of the biggest puzzles in the last election cycle. So at the end of the book, I talk about I borrow very heavily from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, her work, who many of you may, and I give a kind of a eulogy for white Christian America at the end of the book. I begin the book with an obituary, and I end the book with a eulogy. And I borrow heavily here, and I think this is actually quite helpful in thinking about what's going on. And what I want to posit here is that what we're experiencing is, again, a group that has been accustomed to a kind of dominance and a kind of cultural hegemony and being both demographically and culturally in power, and finding themselves slipping from that position of power. And what happens when you get this sort of like end-of-life prognosis, right? One way of thinking about this, the first thing you do, you deny it, right? And there's a lot of that. But after sort of, the reports come back in and the tests come back in and, okay, you can't deny it any longer, then you're just angry, right? So we're seeing, I think, a lot of that in our politics today. I also want to say that one of the ways of understanding where particularly white evangelicals were in this last election is this bargaining standpoint. What happens at that point? It's a kind of desperate move, right? So you see the end, and you start saying things like, you know what? If I just get another year to live, I will sort of donate all my possessions to charity. I will, start serving in the soup kitchen. Like, you sort of make all of this up. I can just make my daughter's wedding. Those kinds of things happen. And what happens is any kind of maybe principles one might have had, they sort of go by the wayside to achieve the end that one is after, because it really is a kind of desperate situation. One of the things I think it's an interesting way of understanding what's happening here with white evangelicals in the last election cycle. So white evangelical Protestants, who kind of self-branded really as values voters, right, all the way back to the George W. Bush election, in this election cycle supported Donald Trump at 81%, right? Now, I think that has been one of the, I fielded more questions about that than anything else since the election, is like, what's going on? That these values voters who said they cared about candidates' character and all these kinds of criteria, and Trump doesn't meet any of them in a way, then why are they supporting him at such high levels? I think we have a clue in this slide here. So we asked a question in 2011 about candidates' character and how important it was for support. And the question was an agree or disagree question about do you agree or disagree that an elected official who commits an immoral act in their personal life can still behave ethically and fulfill their duties in public and professional life? And we asked this question first in 2011. White evangelical Protestants were the least likely group to agree with that statement, right? 30% of white evangelicals agreed with that statement. We asked this question leading in just about a month before the 2016 election, and white evangelicals had gone from being the least likely group here to agree with that statement to the most likely group to agree with that statement. 72% now agreed that you could sort of draw this line between a person's immoral private behavior and their life and their public performance in office. So the only thing that changed here is Donald Trump at the top of the ticket, right? The composition of evangelicals hasn't really changed. That's the only real difference. So I began to think about this hard, and I began to think that one of the ways of understanding what happened in this last election is that many white Christian voters who had kind of marched under this banner of values voters had really become what I began calling nostalgia voters, right? And this appeal to make America great again, that last word again, was the word that did most of the work and sort of thinking about support. So we do a survey of Americans every election cycle in partnership with the Brookings Institution. And typically what we do is we sit around the table with E.J. Dionne and Bill Galston, who are our partners in the work there, and we ask, okay, like, what are the big policy debates that are shaping the election? How can we kind of get some questions that can cast some light on that? And we sat around this table at Brookings for like an hour and just couldn't quite figure out what the big policy debates were in this last election, right? And we finally decided it's really not about policy at the end of the day. It's a kind of referendum on a kind of vision of who we are as a country and who we should be as a country. So we wrote a series of questions trying to get at that. And one of the most illuminating ones, one of the most predictive questions of how people voted in the last election was this question. And that is, do you think the country has, since the 1950s, do you think the American way of life and society have changed for the better or changed for the worse? It turns out that the country is evenly divided on this question, with about half the country saying it's changed for the better since the 1950s, and about half the country saying it's changed for the worse. And what I've done is I've sorted left to right kind of different groups. These aren't mutually exclusive groups, but a way of kind of giving you a sense of who's on which side of the equation here. I'm going to put up first just the people who say things have changed, mostly changed for the better. You can see kind of some commonalities here. It's Democrats overall, religiously unaffiliated Americans, Hispanic Catholics, African Americans overall, younger Americans, Latinos overall, and whites with a college education are the groups that basically say things have changed for the better since the 1950s. Here's all Americans in the middle, right down the middle. And here are the measures on the other side, right, of people who say that things have changed for the worse since the 1950s. And what you'll see really is that it really is different white Christian groups that populate here, seniors, Republicans overall. And what's kind of remarkable about the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party is if I put the other side up, you can see it. They are essentially our two parties are mirror images on this question. 2/3 of Republicans say things have changed for the worse since the 1950s. 2/3 of Democrats say things have changed for the better. And if you think about the two candidates, I've already mentioned the Make America Great Again, this very backward-looking to a golden era logo on the Republican side. And what did Hillary Clinton have on her side? This sort of H with a forward-pointing arrow on the other side, and this kind of stronger together motif, right? Embracing pluralism and cultural change on her side of the equation. So where does this leave us? I think it leaves us in not surprisingly, we're all living through it, in a very divided place. I'll close with this. The Associated Press did this remarkable poll last year, and they were looking at these kind of divisions, and they found something very, very similar to this, that essentially when they asked Americans whether we were losing a shared sense of American identity, 7 in 10 Republicans and Democrats agreed. Right, so it's one thing that we agree on as a country is that we're losing this shared sense of American identity. But when they went down underneath and asked what kinds of things might hold us together, or what was very important for a shared sense of American identity, the two parties have very different views on this. Republicans say that a shared sense of Christian beliefs and values was very important for being what it meant to be an American. Democrats, on the other hand, said, no, it's a mixing of cultures and people from all over the world. That's what it means to be an American. As you can see, those are two really different, perhaps even mutually exclusive ways of thinking about the idea of what it means to be an American. So I'll leave you with this last image here, a different kind of table scene. So this one is actually a still from a Coca-Cola ad that also ran in 2012, the same year as I received that email that you saw at the very beginning of that kind of white Christian family at prayer. And this was a still from a video that caused a fair amount of controversy, actually. It ran during the Super Bowl in 2012, and it was called It's Beautiful. And it was a montage of different kinds of people and all kinds of different everyday things. But it was America the Beautiful, sung in multiple languages, showing multiple kind of cultural images of Americans, gay people, straight people, all kinds of different people. And it just, at the end, it just said, it's beautiful. And that was it. And it caused quite a stir when it ran during the Super Bowl in 2012. But I think one of the sort of fundamental things we've been thrown back to, I mean, the idea of America has always been an idea, I think. And we're being thrown back, I think, to what is the content of that idea. And I think one of the easy ways of thinking about this, or simple ways of thinking about this, is who are we, right? Are we the black and white photo of the white Christian family at prayer that we saw on the first slide? Or are we sort of this group of people, maybe minus the Coke? I don't know. But are we something that looks more like this at the end of the day? And I think that the two political parties right now are actually reorienting themselves in some ways away from kind of liberal to conservative attitudes and more around the very different answers to this fundamental question. So I'll stop there, and we'll have a little conversation.
Hello, thank you for coming tonight. Robbie, thank you for that presentation. And I appreciate you connecting the dots for us, or at least starting to connect the dots on the changing religious, cultural landscape here and how that connects to the Washington landscape that's changed quite a bit in the last 10 months. What struck me in your presentation was one of the last slides about bargaining and the values voters that voted so overwhelmingly for this president. And I'm curious, I mean, much was made of the need, this president was going to appoint at least one Supreme Court justice, if not more, in the next 4 years. And people really wanted, values voters talked about really wanting a pro-life justice, and they said that was the reason why they voted for President Trump. Was that true? I mean, based on your presentation,
I think it's true, but not the whole truth, is what I would say about this. So there's one of the most crystallizing moments for me as I was puzzling over what is going on with, I grew up in Mississippi. I grew up Southern Baptist in Mississippi. In many ways, these are my people. And I was like, what is happening here? I heard a radio debate between the pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas named Robert Jeffries, who's been in the news quite a lot, some of you may have seen him, and Russell Moore, who was the kind of chief lobbyist for the Southern Baptist Convention. He's the head of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. And Russell Moore was taking this kind of more traditional stance and saying, look, there's no way we can square this circle. Like, we stand for these principles, we stand for these kinds of things in a candidate. We can't really then support Donald Trump. And he, in fact, went as far as to say, and if that's what it means to be an evangelical, I'm going to stop calling myself an evangelical. It's like this very strong statement from him. And then Robert Jeffries, on the other hand, put it, I think, very starkly. And he was one of the earliest supporters of Donald Trump on the campaign trail. And he said, look, when I look out at what's going on in the country today and how things are changing and shifting, we're in such desperate times that when I think of who I want in the Oval Office, and this is literally what he said on NPR, when I think of who I want in the Oval Office, I want the meanest son of a you-know-what I can find, and that's Donald Trump, and that's why I'm supporting him and urging my church members to support him. Fairly remarkable statement from a pastor, kind of tall steeple church that's very prominent in the Southern Baptist Convention, has a lot of influence there. So, and then the other thing I would say, I think, on this point is that if you look at white evaangelical and where they line up on many, many issues that Trump is behind, it's not just that they certainly are sort of, much more in favor by a margin of about 2 to 1, likely to say abortion should be mostly illegal versus mostly legal. That's certainly true, and that issue ranks higher than it does for most Americans. But it still ranks fairly low, actually, on their list of priorities, and typically in elections. It never is up at the top. And when you look at immigration, in particular, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant attitudes, white evangelicals actually agreed with Donald Trump all the way up and down the line on that whole platform of issues. So it wasn't just this one thing, I'll hold my nose and vote for Trump. I mean, they really were on board with the whole agenda pretty much.
They were voting their values, in other words, but they
That's
weren't
right.
necessarily the values that they were talking that openly about.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Well, let me take us back to the George W. Bush elections, where same-sex marriage played such an important role. That was the issue that those elections hinged on, I think. But now I'm wondering,
Yeah.
was it the same? Were there the same dynamics at play during those elections?
Yeah, it's worth remembering that the issue of gay rights has been the animating issue of the conservative Christian campaign. That and actually racial issues have been the kind of DNA of the campaign long before abortion. Abortion was actually added later to that agenda. In fact, right after Roe v. Wade, the Southern Baptist Convention actually put out a statement supportive of Roe v. Wade because they were basically saying, it's a Catholic issue, not our thing. And it wasn't until later it got added to the political agenda. But early on, there really was this all the way from kind of early fights in the 1970s at the local level, but they were all in opposing gay rights. Like, that was part of the DNA from the beginning. And so I think it's really important to remember that piece because I think that most people to the center and left and younger people in particular, have a hard time wrapping their heads around what a nuclear event the Obergefell decision, Supreme Court decision, was in 2015 for conservative white Christians in the country who had spent decades and all kinds of resources, hundreds of millions of dollars and decades dedicated to blocking a decision like that, and then lost not only in the Supreme Court, but lost in the court of public opinion, as those slides show. And in our last poll, I was mentioning that support has now jumped up to over 60% support for same-sex marriage. We also are finding now in this last poll, the first time we have solid majority support among young Republicans for same-sex marriage and among young evangelicals for same-sex marriage. And African Americans who have been really a plurality against are now, they're not a majority for, but they are now a plurality for, more for than against. And so we are seeing, it's really across the board. It's not just that Democrats and liberals have become 90% supportive. It's really everyone has shifted.
So that's really a value that can be kind of removed from the table in terms of a factor that may sway the election one way or the other.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we saw Donald Trump, I think, even hinting at that at the Republican convention, and we had a gay speaker speak at the convention. Now, that it has been the case that there have been a number of issues where the Trump administration really has I think, gone back on many of those promises that he made during the campaign. But I think you did at least seeing him signal toward this sea change.
Right. So do you think, I mean, again, referring to that wonderful graphic with the bargaining and the acceptance, I saw the acceptance in the corner there. Do you think that the last 10 months in Washington will hasten the movement toward acceptance, or do you think this bargaining will be something that we see in for many years to come?
Yeah, I think it's a longer ride than that. Nobody's probably surprised by that. I mean, I do in many ways think that what we saw with the Trump administration was a kind of last stand or a kind of death rattle of a kind of movement kind of on its last legs. But what happened, though, I mean, and it's worth noting that, again, that Donald Trump only won by the Electoral College by 78,000 votes across 3 states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. So that's 0.05% of the 138 million votes that were cast in this election. It's a very, very tiny sliver, and yet it kind of produced all of these changes. But I don't think we're in for a quick anything. I think we're in a kind of longer transition mode. And there is this sort of like depression and disillusionment period that for kind of following this typology out before you get to acceptance, right? So it doesn't go straight from bargaining to acceptance. I mean, the bargain has to fall through before you go anywhere else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so you did a book in 2008 on the progressive religious movement. And the progress that it had made, especially evidenced by the election of Barack Obama. I'm curious, in this election, what happened to that movement? Did that progress wane? Did the progress of conservative activists just overcome that? And what do you kind of predict will become of that movement? What will we see in the years to come?
Well, I think that the progressive religious movement, to the extent there is one, I'm not sure I would quite call it a movement. I might call it a coalition of sorts. It has a lot of challenges that the religious political movement on the right doesn't have, right? So, for instance, like when you're looking at voting, when you've got a kind of homogeneous group of kind of white, non-Hispanic, fairly conservative Christians, it's not that hard to get them in lockstep on a set of issues and to get them mobilized on one side of politics. But for example, if you look at mainline Protestants, right, who have been the backbone of the civil rights movement, working with the African American community, we're very forward on many of those issues. But if you look at 44% of white mainline Protestants vote Republican, right, and so it's not nearly the kind of tipping point that you have in many of those on the right. And so I think it's that challenge of it's not so easily mobilized through churches, not only because of that split, but because it's not the way that progressive religious leaders see their role, right, is the kind of politicizing things from the pulpit. And so I think there's all kinds of built-in things that make it a little more diffuse. It's certainly there, and it's certainly, I think, a part of the coalition on the left. But it's not. I think it's never going to be the leading coalition in many ways that you see it on the right at least as much for internal reasons as for external.
Well, it's also much more diverse, right?
That's
when we're
right,
talking
yeah.
Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Jews. I mean, it's
Yeah.
much more.
And when you've got like, Unitarians who support same-sex marriage at 90% plus in a coalition with African Americans who are in the 40s on their support for an issue like that, I mean, that presents some challenges to kind of hold that coalition together.
Is it also the diversity of issues that coalition wants to address? I mean, we talk about, and perhaps we're oversimplifying it when we say abortion and same-sex marriage. Those are the two key issues. You've added immigration to the conservative agenda. But there seems to be, when I ask somebody in the progressive religious circles, the laundry list of issues that need to be addressed. Is that also maybe a barrier?
I think that's right. Although I do think that what we're witnessing now may actually clarify that a little bit, because I do think this sense of what do we think about a pluralistic society, right? That's ethnically, racially, religiously diverse. Like, is that a good thing or is that a threat? I mean, I think that fundamental question is going to be orienting our political discourse for some time to come.
Yeah. So I want to switch from politics to the pews. Right this very moment in Chicago, or I should say right this very moment, Chicago is presumably the most segregated it ever is all week long, because churches, houses of worship are so homogenous. And I'm curious if you think these demographic shifts that you've addressed here, will that change in the years to come?
Yeah, it's tough. I think the racial lines, Martin Luther King Jr. was famous, said this a number of times, that, so here we are, we're at 12:30 p.m. on Sunday, but he was famous for saying 11 a.m. on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America, right? That's largely still true. 86% of churches today are still essentially monoracial churches, even though that's fewer. There's more of them than there were in the past, but it's still overwhelmingly homogenous, and we're still socially segregated in so many ways. I went looking sort of for where a kind of mixing was happening across racial and religious lines. There are just so few places where it's happening. We have lost most of the ground that we gained up into the 1980s after the Brown v. Board of Education Act. The 80s was the high mark of public school integration, and we've been losing ground ever since, and are almost back to where we were, not legally, but because of the way social arrangements and white flight and other things have arranged. And if you look at Chicago, I mean, Chicago is always up there with as one of the most segregated cities, with a kind of brutal history of redlining and real estate markets and keeping, non-whites out of white neighborhoods. And you could still just look at it on the ground and see it there on the ground. And that legacy, I think, it's hard to undo. But I think we got to find some ways of kind of reaching across those lines. I do think religious groups have a responsibility and actually some great potential for doing that. If you just take churches, for example, there are still, even with the decline of religiosity in America, there are still more churches than there are post offices in the country, right? And especially in places where, outside of big cities, those are still some of the most robust institutions standing. And I think if we could find a way to have those places, not just sort of rest on their own racist kind of history, but really make some progress in reaching across those lines. And there's a few examples of that happening, that's what it's going to take. Mm-hmm.
And if they did a letter writing campaign, they could bolster both institutions, post offices and churches.
That's right.
I want to also go. I'm now going to pivot back to politics, because I forgot to ask you this one question, and that is, and you talk about this in the book, the Tea Party. That is a term that I've not really heard uttered that much in the past 10 months. What has happened to the Tea Party? And, I mean, is it still as robust and people are just too busy uttering the word Trump? What's going on with the Tea Party?
Yeah, what's interesting is that, I mentioned we do a study with Brookings, and back in 2010, when the Tea Party was first really ascendant, we did a study to try to figure out, okay, who are these people? Where did they come from? They kind of seem to come out of nowhere. And what we found actually was that it was more of a rebranding of kind of on the right edge of the Republican Party, rebranding people who were there. Picked up a few independents, but for the most part, it was a rebranding and a kind of gathering together of people on the right. It was never actually libertarian. We did a whole series of measures and you were much more likely to predict someone being a member of the Tea Party if they opposed gay marriage, for example, which is the exact opposite of a libertarian position than you were a whole bunch of other things that might be more traditional libertarian. And about half of them, this is I think half of the people who were in the Tea Party also said they considered themselves members of the Christian right. Right, so it had this kind of very much an overlap, and I think basically what's happened is, we used to talk about the Christian right, then the Tea Party, and now the Trump coalition, and in many ways those are the same people, just kind of traveling through different, wearing different T-shirts.
Different brands.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So my last question before I turn it over to the audience, you talked about population shifts, but population and political power are two very different things. So I'm curious, when will we see these demographic shifts directly affecting voting patterns and elections? Not indirectly, based on fear and insecurity about their identity, but directly influencing the outcome of elections.
Yeah, so as you might imagine, so the book came out in 2016 in July. The hardback came out well ahead of the election. I don't talk about Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton in the book. And so after the election, though, I got a lot of email like, oh, really? The end of white Christian America? It's not looking like that so much. So the publisher graciously gave me 8 pages in the paperback to explain it all. So which came out this past summer. But here's what's important, I think, to realize. And I think until I really started digging in harder, it wasn't quite as clear to me. But I think the simplest way to put it is this, that in the U.S. context, because of the way voter turnout works, the ballot box essentially acts like a time machine. And it takes us back about 10 years to what the demographics looked like in the country about 10 years ago. The main reason for that is because white Christians in the country turn out to vote at higher rates than other Americans do. So it means that they're overrepresented always at the ballot box. And since the trends are that they're declining as a proportion of the population, so in this last election, I mean, they look like, the electorate looks about like the population did, back in 2006. And if you go forward, it looks like our best projections are that it's going to be 2024 before we have the first election where white Christians make up less than a majority at the ballot box and as part of the electorate. So we're still 2 presidential election cycles forward before that's going to happen, sort of even on its own. And then the one caveat here is that if we get a raft of policies that are around voter ID, more restrictive voter ID laws, felony disenfranchisement, gerrymandering districts, all of these things that we know disproportionately affect minority voters, it could extend maybe even a little bit further. But just as in its natural fallout, it'll be 2 more election cycles. And just to give you one small detail on this, to give you an idea of just how much overrepresentation is there, in this last election cycle, in the population, white evangelical voters, that core of Donald Trump support, only made up 17% of the population, but they made up 26% of voters, right, because of their higher turnout rates.
Okay. Thank you so much, Robbie. I would like to hear from the audience. Yes. We have folks coming around with microphones, so if you have a question for Robbie, please raise your hand and they'll hand you a microphone, and I will leave them in charge of selecting you.
Could you focus for a moment on immigration in particular, and both illuminate some of the attitudes as they vary across these segments of American population, and the trends, how they have changed in the same time period that you focused on for the other issues?
Sure, great. It's a great question. So we have a little bit of a paradox in terms of immigration in the country. If we ask about basic policy issues, like what should we do with the approximately 11 million people who are in the country illegally, there's actually we've been tracking this very clearly, at least since 2010. The numbers have not shifted that much. So no matter whether there's been a bill there was this bipartisan bill, there was just a Democratic bill, and like all the ups and downs of the political process, Americans' attitudes have not changed that much. And it's usually about 6 in 10 Americans, like super majorities of Democrats and about half of Republicans, who support a path to citizenship, a full path to citizenship, provided people meet certain requirements. very, very few, only about 15% of Americans support some more limited solution like a permanent legal residency status, but falls short of citizenship. And about 1 in 5 Americans say we should just identify and deport everyone in that category. So it's a very, very minority position. Even among Republicans, only about a third of Republicans favor the identify and deport options. That's rank and file Republicans. But the politics of it don't look like that, right? That's a real challenge. On DACA, this kind of policies around what should we do with children who are brought here by their parents, really through no kind of action of their own, but brought by parents illegally as a kid, but who've been here, living here, going to high school, and are now serving in the military, going to college, other kinds of things. There is also fairly strong support. About 7 in 10 Americans support kind of keeping that program going. But the politics, again, are kind of in the way. And I think in particular, this last election, where, if you watched, I just remember being so struck by the Republican National Convention and the Democratic National Convention, and if you watched those and paid attention to kind of immigration policy, I mean, they were such starkly different images of kind of who immigrants are, how we should react as a country, what our goals are. And you even heard from Stephen Miller, questioning something as basic as the, give me your tired, give me your, from the Statue of Liberty, like that's not really part of kind of who we are. And so I think those shifts are, I think, really upon us. And so we haven't quite seen it yet. I mean, we've been watching the needle move. And what we've seen is, if you ask questions about fears and anxieties, we have seen shifts there where Americans as a whole have more concerns, more fears, more anxieties. But so far, it actually hasn't moved the needle that much on policy at the kind of rank and file level.
On a geographic basis, I'm curious how a blue state evangelical compares to a red state evangelical, if there is a difference.
Yeah. This is a great question. One of the interesting things that we're finding across the board, and in political science, there's a lot of literature on this, is that the regional differences that we have usually been accustomed to in the country are getting flattened out by partisanship, right? So we're seeing less regional differences on a whole range of issues. What matters much more is mostly partisanship, and then education levels and those kinds of things that matter more. So there are certainly some differences, but there is such a heavy geographic concentration of white evangelicals in the South and the Midwest. Like, that's really where the geographic center is. Much fewer on the coast, and certainly fewer in New England there. You see some differences, but they're not quite as muted. The bigger differences you'll see is between college-educated and non-college-educated evangelicals, between Republican and Democratic-affiliated evangelicals. There's still about 1 in 5 evangelicals who identify as Democrat still. And so those are the much bigger differences than the regional stuff.
Yes, my question is the woman. I didn't see anything in the statistics regarding, and with all the misogyny, and you're mentioning education now, I hear more women than men are graduating from college, and this has got to be a big factor.
Great, yeah. So it certainly plays a role, but anybody who's looking at the exit polls, I think one of the things the Democrats were waiting is for white women to implode, right, in terms of support for Trump, and it didn't really materialize. There was some pullback, but there wasn't the sort of broad pullback because of the sexual assault comments and those kinds of things. It just didn't materialize. And I think it's a very similar thing to this, is that one of the real struggles, I think, I think if we think about a healthy democracy, one of the real struggles we have to think about is how do we, I think, loosen up the lockhold that partisanship has on our lives, right? Because it's remarkable that in this election cycle, again, very little moved. I mean, there was just enough in just the right places, but we had this, very unconventional candidate on the Republican ticket. We had the first woman from a major party on the Democratic ticket, and the voting patterns looked really, really similar to what we would have seen. We didn't see the only place that I could find that where you see like 20 percentage points movement away from a historical voting pattern was among Mormons, right, who moved about 20 percentage points away from Donald Trump, mostly toward Evan McMullen, right? There's a third-party candidate that they moved toward. But if you're looking for kind of a values voters effect, it was really among Mormons in this last election cycle who moved away from their traditional support for a Republican candidate. One small little anecdote, just because it's coming to mind, I think is important, that it's really negative partisanship that is, I think, the corrosive thing here. It's less and less that people love their own party and more that they hate the other, party, right? So political science call this like a negative partisanship effect. One of my favorite examples of this that's easy to understand is that some Stanford political scientists back in 1960 asked this really provocative question. They said, how worried would you be if your son or your daughter married someone from the opposite political party? So in 1960, only 5% of Democrats and 6% of Republicans said that this would bother them a lot. They asked it again in 2012. YouGov, Huffington Post, asked this question again in 2012, and it had jumped to 33% of Democrats and 50% of Republicans said it would bother them a lot if their son or their daughter married someone of the opposite political party. And I think the challenge there is, what it means is that in 1960 and just a few decades ago, partisanship was something we took to the ballot box with us. And I think increasingly it's something we just take to bed with us every night.
The graphs that you showed on religious affiliation were really amazing. The difference between the older generations, 50 and 65 above, versus the lack of religious affiliation on the lower end. I do, though, think that there might be another factor involved here, and that is, I take it from my own personal experience. If I were to answer that question, even though I'm no longer a practicing member of my religion, I would state, yeah, I was born into a Christian family or a Jewish family, and I would report myself as that. Whereas I look at my son, and he's got the same degree of non-religious affiliation that I do, and he'd be more likely to say, he's a millennial, I'm not going to reply that I'm affiliated with any religion. So did that come up as a factor in what you saw?
Yeah, it is remarkable that as recently as 1990s, in the mid-1990s, only 6%, like 5-6%, depending on the poll you look at, of Americans claim no religious affiliation, right? So that's 6%, now it's 24%, just since the 1990s. So it's a very remarkable shift in the American context. One of the things that's going on is it's certainly driven by young people, and it's driven from young people exiting white Christian churches for the most part. That's where those numbers are coming from. And one of the things we're looking at when we ask those young people, we've asked them, like, why did you leave? What was going on? Some of it is it's like, I just stopped believing the stuff, like the dogma, the teachings. But when you press a little further, it's usually around clashes with science, right? It's about evolution, it's about climate change, those kinds of things, and they couldn't kind of get it kind of squared away with their particular church's beliefs. But about a third of them say that it was negative teachings about gay and lesbian people or negative treatment of gay and lesbian people. That's a third of those millennials who have left who said that was an important reason why they left. And then the other thing is, I think this partisan nature that many churches have taken on is also a huge turnoff for the millennial generation. They don't really want to be in a politicized church. And the other thing, Robert Putnam and Will Campbell wrote this book called American Grace a few years back, and they were pretty good about documenting this. And they basically showed that, look, part of what was going on is that just as this generation was kind of coming of age, churches and religion in general became synonymous with the conservative Christian right. And it was that sort of push-off from that identification that religion as a whole means this. And it was kind of at odds with a lot of the values of that generation. That was actually part of the push-off, too. So I think we're still figuring it out and still exploring. It's certainly a complex thing. But the people who are in that category are people who say, not just that I don't go to church or not just that it's not important, but they won't claim the label. Like when you say, are you Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, other, they won't claim any of those labels, and they say, I'm nothing. That's how they get into that category.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I wonder if you could explore the very big thread of racial equality and racial justice and all of these patterns. And I wonder if you could add to that what at least I perceive as this fundamental conflict between Christian belief and inequality and injustice towards others. And I wonder if you see that internal conflict playing out much.
Yeah, I'll take the last piece of this first. One of the things I think we're also having to reckon with these changes on the ground is the ways in which Christianity has been fairly plastic and malleable in the country. And so we're having all these arguments over Robert E. Lee and the Civil War and what it was about and what does it mean. And I think it's probably a helpful thing. But one of the things that it's going to sort of throw up is this reality, right? That so when you say these things don't square with Christian teaching, the next question is, well, which Christian teaching, right? There were plenty of churches in the South that were totally fine with slavery and squared that quite comfortably with Christian teaching and what it meant to be Christ-like and all of that stuff, and what it meant to be biblical, right? All that stuff was squared away nice and neat with slavery and completely consistent. And it wasn't until later, right, that we could say something like, well, slavery is against Christian teaching. Not so much, not that long ago, right? And so I think it's kind of putting us back on those things. And I think, in particular, the distance between white evangelical Protestants in the South and African American Protestants is just dramatic. It doesn't matter which question you ask. If it's, one of the ones that I think is we're here in Chicago, and the issue of police shootings, all right, is a kind of big issue. And we asked this question about whether people thought that the killing of unarmed black men by police were isolated incidents or part of a broader pattern of how police treat African Americans. So about 85% of African Americans say it's part of a broader pattern of how police treat African Americans, but only 44% of whites agree with that statement, and only 29% of white evangelicals agree with that statement. Now, when you've got a 40 to 60 point chasm on something as fundamental as that, I mean, it tells you a lot about why we can't have a coherent conversation around some of these issues. And I think bridging those chasms is just got to be fundamentally what we have to be about going forward.
Could you speak a little bit about whether you're developing measures or have measures to track the sort of disdain for expertise and how that plays into all of this?
Disdain for facts.
Yeah, well, as someone who, is hopefully producing data and facts, this is a question close to home. Exactly right. So I continue to think that, one of the best things we're doing is trying to be just transparent about how we ask questions, about how we gather the sample, all that stuff. But we are asking some questions. We also, it's under embargo right now. We'll be out December 5th at Brookings. But we are having some questions about just what do people think about, like, the media. Our reporters, for example, even like granting reporters a good faith effort. Like, are they just trying from the beginning to skew a story? Or are they really trying to report it objectively? Even if they don't get there, you'll be happy to know we're asking this question. Or maybe not happy if you see the results. But I think these kind of questions about, science, these basic questions about science and what we're seeing about, with the EPA right now, we just had some scientists who are forbidden from going to a conference, right? Just on ideological grounds. I think these are really fundamental questions. They're generationally divided. They're religiously divided, and it is this kind of reality, different reality. I think it ties back to this broader theme. Who are we going to be as Americans? What do we believe in? What are we about? And fundamentally, what do we take to be true about the world? And I think it is a challenge because the questions aren't just about policy anymore. I think they kind of go all the way down. And finding ways to talk about across those divides with media, entities really on both sides to some extent. The best studies I've seen, do show that on the right, it's more powerful ideological pull on the right than the left. But where do we, how do we deal with that when we have all these forces aligned and that are about manipulating these differences, for some short-term political gains? I think it's a really troubled place we're in, and finding some ways to kind of push back on that, I think, is going to be important, really, for the country as a whole.
Thank you all for these really wonderful questions.
Thank you.